Hey, aloha everyone, it's Felix here with your Word on the Street, and we're continuing our teaching in the revelation of Jesus Christ. Specifically, we're going to be continuing on in our teaching on the assurances from the victory of the Lamb as Jesus explains them through the seventh trumpet to John. Okay, and if you recall from all of the previous teachings that we've done in the last couple months, in the first assurance, we learned that the redeemed will be with Jesus. The second assurance was that the gospel is going to be preached to the entire world. And then in the third assurance is that Babylon, which is considered a godless state and religion, it's going to fall. The fourth assurance tells us that justice is going to be executed. And in the fifth assurance, we learn that the dead will be at rest and rewarded. And in our most recent teaching from last week, in the sixth assurance from God, we actually learned that the harvest of the godly is going to take place. So if the godly are going to be harvested, who's next? It's going to be the ungodly. As we move along in our next teaching, let's grab our Bibles and open up to Revelation chapter 14, verses 17 and 20 in a teaching entitled The Proclamation of Three Angels, Part 6, Reaping the Grapes of Wrath. Beginning in verse 17, John writes, he says, "And then another angel came out of the temple, which is in heaven, he also having a sharp sickle." And then in verse 18 he says, "And another angel came out from the altar who had power over fire, and he cried with a loud cry to him who had a sharp sickle, saying, Thrust your sharp sickle and gather the clusters of the vine of the earth, for her grapes are fully ripe." And then continuing on, John says in verse 19, he says, "So the angel thrust his sickle into the earth and gathered the vine of the earth and threw it into the great winepress of the wrath of God." And then finally closing out in this passage in verse 20, John writes, he says, "And the winepress was trampled outside of the city, and blood came out of the winepress up all the way to the horse's bridle for 1,600 furlongs. All right. So this passage right here, it reflects, just an overview, it reflects the harvest of the ungodly and the evil of this world. I told you we're going to be talking about those two concepts throughout the entire teachings, okay? And the people of the world, much like they are today, will be full of idolatry, murder, and immorality. And the focus of their lives is going to be materialistic, and it's going to be all about like things in the world with like an atheistic and God-hating mentality. You know, the passage gives us an idea of the harvester in verse 17, in which he will harvest the ungodly in verses 18 and 19, and then finally reveals a glimpse of the terror of Armageddon, where God's wrath actually falls upon man in verse 20. So let's break down this passage verse by verse so we understand the full context of what we're reading here. And starting off in verse 17, where John says that, "And then another angel came out of the temple, which is in heaven, he also having a sharp sickle." So this angel, he comes out of the temple, okay? And like in the verse says, it's in heaven. So what does that mean? That means that this angel was directly in the presence of God, okay? And he had a mission. His mission is special, and it's specific from God, because if you notice here, he's also holding a sharp sickle. And it's indicative of judgment throughout Scripture. So that takes us into the next passage where John says in verse 18 that, "And another angel came out from the altar," okay? "And he had power over fire, and he cried with a loud cry to him who had a sharp sickle, saying, Thrust in your sharp sickle and gather the clusters of the vine of the earth, for her grapes are fully ripe." So one angel is crying out to the other one, and that one from the altar saying, "Throw your sickle down. Go for it." So this verse in particular has some clues as to who and where this second angel is from. First, this angel, he doesn't come from the presence of God, but from the altar, which is, especially in Revelation, which is specifically where the prayers of God's people are kept, and where the martyred saints were at in heaven. Previous teachings, I talked about that. And from the time of those who have gone before us in believing and following Jesus, there have been millions of believers that have been martyred. Even at the end of time, there's going to be millions upon millions of people that are going to be martyred. Okay? So this second angel, he reveals two things to us in this verse, okay? Specifically, first, he had power of fire. So in Scripture, this means that the fire of God's judgment will be cast on the earth, and that every ungodly and evil person who does not believe in Jesus will be taken over by fire. And then second, the angel cried with a loud cry for judgment to begin. The ungodly and the evil people left in the world are they're going to be said like in clusters of the vine of the earth, like grapes hanging on a vine. And that vine belongs to the world instead of the vine that belongs to Jesus. You know, Jesus said in John chapter 15, verse 5, that he is the vine. We are the branches, and he that abides in Jesus, or in him, and I in him, the same brings forth much fruit. For without me, you can do nothing. I mean, Jesus is saying that. So if we don't abide in Jesus, we can't do anything. And there is nothing that we can do without him. You know, his vine is pure, whereas the earth is like a vine of worldliness, ungodliness, and evil. And it's going to be ripe and full grown at the end of times with the Antichrist. Man has free will, okay? And that means that each person chooses which vine they're going to hang from, which cluster of grapes that they're going to abide with. They could either, they're going to be followers of Jesus, or they're going to be followers of the world. You know, will they be considered righteous through Christ, or they're going to be like followers of the ungodly and the evil of this world? That's their choice to make. You can't do it for anybody else. Every person has to make their choice, Jesus or the world. And that takes us into our second revelation from this angel here. This is the second part. He says, this is going to be a time of God's wrath. And in the time of the most horrible judgment, you have to understand that the earth will have ever seen. John says in verse 19, he says, so the angel thrust his sickle into the earth and gathered the vine of the earth, and he threw it into the great winepress of the wrath of God. So that's what his mission was, is to gather the people and to put them into judgment. As the angel lifts up his sickle into the air, and with this awesome stroke, he tears his sickle through the sky and into the earth for eternal judgment. So the vine of the earth that I previously spoke about, it's going to be severed with all of the ungodliness, all of the evil of the earth as they're cut down, and they're going to be gathered. And then they're going to be cast into the winepress, and that right there is where they're going to suffer to God's wrath there. Okay? So the winepress of God's wrath, what is that? We don't really see it unless you're in wine or you understand the concept of how they make wine. But in ancient biblical times, a winepress was made out of stone, and it was placed over like large vats, like basically like bags. And grapes were placed in the trough, and people would walk over the grapes, and the juice would actually drip down into the holes that were from the bottom of the trough, and they go into these big bags. And this verse represents the trampling of man like grapes under the foot of God. There's going to be no mercy and no grace. Two specific descriptions are shown here from this specific part. First, the trampling of the grapes, it's going to be a deliberate action, okay? It's going to have purpose. And that purpose is that God's righteousness and just execution against the ungodly and the evil of the earth, okay? It's specific. Every single person will stand before God, and the ungodly and the evil of the world, they're going to be cast into the winepress of God's wrath and trampled under the foot of God without mercy. And that's scary to think about. Secondly, is that the trampling of the grapes, it's going to be complete and thorough destruction of man under God's wrath. There will be not one person who is ungodly or evil will be able to hide or escape the trampling within God's winepress and his holy wrath, okay? There will be no favoritism, no partiality, no discrimination, okay? It's going to be all inclusive. If you're ungodly and evil, that's where you're going to go. John reminded us in John chapter 3, verse 36, he says, "He who believes in the Son has everlasting life, and he who does not believe in the Son shall not see life, but the wrath of God abides in him. That is scary, and that is true. Okay? For believers, we're safe. For those that don't, man. And then finally, in the last verse of this passage, the place where the wrath of the judgment of God is to take place, it's known as Armageddon, and it's spoken of here. Very important to understand 2 points that are made in this verse that John writes, okay? Check it out. He says in verse 20, and the winepress was trampled outside the city, and the blood came out of the winepress all the way up to like the horse's bridle for 1,600 furlongs. All right. I know the horse races. I know how long a furlong is. It's a long way, and I'm going to tell you. First, the winepress, that all of the ungodliness and the evil remnants of the world will be trampled by God, and they're going to be it's going to be done outside the city of Jerusalem. Okay, and this is the great battle of Armageddon. It's the great day of the Lord. It's the final battle of human history and the end of Satan's rule upon the earth. And this is the picture of it. Okay, it's in Megiddo. It's there. The picture of the world's like armies are going to be gathered together under the command of the Antichrist, and in an instant, okay, by the mighty power of the word of the Lord, along with his presence, it will be the fastest defeat of a military force and of man. Okay, as a matter of fact, Paul, he proclaimed to us in 2 Thessalonians chapter 2, he says, beginning in verse 8 here, and this passage is really important to understand. Paul says in verse 8, he says, and then the lawless one, being the Antichrist, okay, he's going to be revealed, whom the Lord will consume with the breath of his mouth and destroy with the brightness of his coming. So here he is. He's there in his word, okay? 2 things. And the coming of the lawless one is according to the work of Satan. So Satan brings them on with all power, signs, and lying wonders, and with all unrighteous deception among those who perish, because they did not receive the love of the truth that they might be saved. So these are people that are hardened to the word of Jesus, even in the end of times. And then secondly, take a look at what this place will look like, okay? Blood will come out of the winepress, and it's going to rise up to the height of a horse's bridle. So that's where all the gear and the tack is all in the horse's mouth. And that's about 4 to 6 feet high. And then John wrote that it would be extend out for 1,600 furlongs. That's a distance of 185 miles. All right? That's a lake of blood, which is how many will perish in this judgment of man from the winepress of God, trampled underfoot. Several books in Scripture refer to this scene. Isaiah 63, Joel 3, Revelation 19. There will be no one left. 6 feet high by 165 miles long. Okay? You're either in or you're out. There will be no more second, third, or 100th chance. This is why it's so important to just take my advice here and all those other believers out there and come to Jesus now, just how you are. You don't have to be perfect, because no one is, before you don't get another chance. Revelation chapter 14, verses 17 to 20, the proclamations of 3 angels, part 6, reaping the grapes of wrath, and that's your word on the street.